welcome, Philip. Great to have you join us. Philip is the head of technology, the CTO, and the head of AI at SAP, obviously one of the largest technology companies in the world, software companies in the world. And what I'm so excited about is we'll have someone in both roles, meaning a technologist who's also responsible not just for AI in terms of building that into the SAP roadmap, but also in terms of the adoption of AI inside of SAP. So welcome, Philip. Where are you joining us from today?
Thank you so much, Greg. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm joining actually from my outpost here in Potsdam. It's like, I don't know, 30-minute ride from Berlin, if you don't know where this is.
Great, good, thank you. All right, let's talk about you for a minute because you've been in this game before AI turned up, and you're obviously in this game when it was in its machine learning phase,
Sure. Yeah.
essentially prior to this iteration of AI, which is Gen AI. So are you surprised when you think about what happened two and a half years ago with the release of ChatGPT? And then could you update us in terms of, are you surprised now in terms of what's happened in the last 2 years? So let's go back for a minute and talk about when this exploded, when I would say that's really ChatGPT. What were your reactions in the moment back then?
Well, I think fundamentally, to your point, right? I mean, AI overall for us was a topic for many, many years, right? And that even predates deep learning, right? Classical machine learning algorithms. We actually started with stuff like hidden Markov models, right? Support vector machines. If somebody, I think we still called this data mining back in the days, if I remember correctly. Before then, was more moving into machine learning. I think it was I think it was not overall a total surprise, right? If you saw the evolution and specifically what large language models would do, right? With the evolution of GPT-1, 2, 3, and then 3.5. I think we saw this coming. I think the big leap forward was just very surprising how quickly it all of a sudden happened. And in particular, these zero-shot capabilities, right? That these models exposed all of a sudden and what they could do. And what this really changed for us as a software vendor, because unlike maybe other technology companies, what we were always busy with, and that was a big challenge back in the days, was how do you solve this last mile problem? The last mile problem towards adoption. Because it's great if you can train something in the labs as an independent software vendor. You can train something in the labs, you can train a bunch of machine learning models, but then you distribute it to all your customers, and it almost never worked. Because the challenge was that, of course, that then the customers may have changed the data model a little bit. And of course, the data distribution is different. Maybe the feature selection work is, so you need to rerun it on the customer side and retrain it, right, on the specifics of the customer's data. And as a result, it never really scaled because it was a customer's project then, and then the customers would have to hire a bunch of maybe data scientists, which it didn't have, right? So it was a scaling issue, essentially. And with Gen AI, of course, that presented a phenomenal opportunity because with all the various techniques that meanwhile are all common to us, whether it's few-shot prompting, chain of thought, all kinds of RAG techniques that we know today, it solved the fundamental distribution issue because now you can actually light up way more AI experience way more quickly across a wide range of customers. Independent of the data distribution, feature selection, and so on and so forth. So you can deliver something that works out of the box, which then aligned very much with our strategy. Because what we have learned at SAP is the adoption really in the enterprise happens if basically two things are fulfilled. Number one, you have all the data already, right, curated, and the data is there from an enterprise perspective, right, from a security and from a data privacy perspective. But then secondly, you can turn it on with the click of a button and boom, it works, right? And that was always very hard to achieve in the past. If you want to serve 400,000 enterprise customers, what we do at SAP. And that's Gen AI was a big leap forward also for us to make that actually possible, to bring more AI in finance and HR, supply chain. So that's a little bit where we are coming from.
Yep, makes sense. So let's fast forward then. So the last 2 years,
Mhm.
the pace of the change in terms of the improvement in models, and in some cases, frankly, no improvement, like hallucinations still seem to be troubling us, at least as an end user. Just curious, your observations about the last 2 years. Are you surprised at the pace? What else have you noticed? Like,
I wouldn't say that
what's
we
the
are
vibe? What's the vibe right now?
well, I wouldn't be surprised. I think the overall discussion, I think in two waves, right? I think the initial Gen AI wave, right, to maybe use Gartner hype cycle terms, is, I mean, it was clearly on the peak of inflated expectations 2 years ago, right? And now you could argue, are we already reaching the plateau of productivity? Or are we still in the middle of the trough of disillusionment? I don't care so much. That's a more philosophical question for analysts. But, you know, I think on this one, the discussion also with customers and so on became way clearer of what works and what doesn't work, right? I think meanwhile, we have a much better, at not individually maybe, but at scale, a better discussion what the technology can and cannot do. Also, in which cases you can actually, with various techniques, reduce hallucinations to a acceptable minimum, again, with various techniques, knowledge graphs, for example, ontologies, something we use very heavily. Um, but then at the same time, you have to kind of talk a little bit more about agents, I guess, too. I think there's this second wave coming now that is, again, in my mind, on the peak of inflated expectations as it relates to agents of what these agentic workflows, and there's a huge variety of different definitions of what agents are out there in the industry. I think there's a plethora of different interpretations and expectations on what the technology can and cannot do today. And I believe at the moment, it feels also actually inside SAP, it feels a little bit like 2023 again, where we try to really figure out what can we reliably deliver to the customer from a customer experience perspective versus where are the limitations of what we cannot deliver as of today.
Why does the industry, and I'm not referring to SAP specifically, and I don't really want to talk too much about SAP. I really want to talk about sort of the broader
Mhm.
sort of AI industry and AI challenges. Why does the AI industry constantly sort of overhype its capabilities? What do you think is going on there in terms of selling so far ahead of capabilities? Using benchmarks, frankly, that aren't real life benchmarks. They seem to me very sort of academic or contrived benchmarks to show improvement in model performance. Sort of what's going on in your mind in terms of why primarily Silicon Valley, I would say, seems to be
Well, of course, there are different forces, right, from my vantage point here at play, right? On the one side, clearly, I mean, everybody wants to be the first, right, and wants to be the leader in that space and wants to build something, right, that kind of taps into this imagination, of course, that all these generative AI experience give you. Because the reality is, if you just look at this very naively, I mean, it looks phenomenal, right? And this is
Mhm.
also, I mean, the title of today's podcast is called "Why Are Certain Experiments or Pilots Get Stuck?" Right?
Yeah,
Because originally everybody thought like, "Oh wow, this is so easy to use," right? Back to the zero-shot prompting capabilities of, for example, large language models or image models. How hard can it be to build something useful with it, right? And it also democratized the access again, right? I mean, I feel every decade in the AI industry, there was a big leap forward because it democratized the technology to a broader set of people. All right. And now with generative AI, again, right, a broader set of people that initially believes, oh, this is so simple to use, right? In this case, even the C-level and so on, who's then like, oh, how hard can it be to build something useful with it? And then it turns out to be actually much harder to build specifically in the enterprise something that is really useful and that's reliable and that adheres to doesn't worry the CISO all day long, right? On all the security
yeah.
and what happens with my data, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there is, of course, this need and this driving factor of being the first, right? And always being perceived as the leader, while simultaneously, of course, there is a gap towards the reality on what
Right.
actually can be deployed by customers today and really make that technology useful.
So is this why to me, it feels like it's been a consumer and small business revolution so far. If you look at particularly if you look at OpenAI's numbers, the Chat GPT usage numbers, Sam Altman let slip at TED a couple weeks ago that maybe there's 700, 800 million users of Chat GPT, which is a pretty stunning number when you think about it, almost 10% of the world's population. It feels like, and somewhat again reported by OpenAI, their numbers seem to be being driven in terms of revenue and usage by consumers, small business. So what's going on there, and why is larger enterprise lagging, or are they not lagging? Is this just typical? We're only really 2 or 3 years in this cycle, and is this what we'd expect? Meaning it takes large enterprise longer, a decade or more to really deploy successfully. What's your take on what's going on?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say it's a decade, right? I mean, if I look at all the large customers, right, the big companies, take the Fortune 500, right, 2000, whatever, pick whatever. I mean, they all have significant initiatives running in there, right? Because they understand, of course, the value and the promise, right, of the technology and how to bring them forward. But the challenge, and of course, I mean, it's a little bit maybe comparable to the introduction of the iPhone that also started in the consumer space and become very popular. We called this, I think, consumerization of IT back then, right? And then of course, you use it at your home, and then you want to get rid of your BlackBerry, right? Because you like the iPhone, right? And then, of course, challenge your IT department, like, hey, make it possible that this also works within my company so I can use it as a business phone too. And of course, it takes then a little bit of time, right? I mean, also back in the days, stuff like mobile device management had to be invented and a bunch of other things too, to make it really secure and reliable and manage a fleet of company devices and so on and so forth. So enterprise requirements and readiness, there's always an uplift towards the consumer space. In particular, of course, everybody is then concerned, oh, if I could just go to ChatGPT, I enter my data. I don't enter my data just in ChatGPT because I don't want to find my P&L or my personal from my personnel, all the data, right? Then all of a sudden in the next generation of whatever GPT models or Gemini models and whatsoever. So of course, there are legit concerns, right? That need to be worked through. And that was, of course, a discussion predominantly in the last 1 or 2 years, right? How do you really make it accessible within the enterprise? So that and so that really there's no data leakage, right? And you have a secure, trusted environment. You only use these models for inferencing, or if you fine tune them, right, you know exactly where you run this model physically also, and have trust and control and governance around that too. This is also where we started, quite frankly, right? Give you just an example out of SAP, where the first thing that we did is like 2 years ago, we created an internal playground with the various models from then, from Azure and from GCP and from AWS, right? And some own deployed models in our own GPU, just to enable the internal workforce, no matter whether they worked. These were just the large language models, as they are, right? It's basically a little ChatGPT experience just inside the company. And then the other big challenge is, of course, the data. How do you really make it useful? Because, of course, it's great what you can do in the consumer space with these
Sure, a recipe or a fitness plan or a
fitness
travel
plans and
plan.
all these
Sure.
things.
Yeah,
But it's not
great.
relevant for business at the end of the day, because it, of course, doesn't know what's your P&L and what's your demand and what's your sales and operations plan and what's your HR headcount, your integrated finance HR plan, and all these things, right? A CFO or a COO is usually interested in. So now the next question was, how do you actually enable to bring the data that is, of course, proprietary and local in the company? How do you bring this together with the right techniques, with these large language models, and use exactly their generic capabilities to make them useful and fruitful within the company on your data, so they produce something that's of value to the company at the end of the day.
I want to
general purpose model.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit more about data. So correct me if don't agree if if you don't agree. My point of view, Philip, is that a lot of C-suite, and we talk to a lot of C-suite every week at Section, I think are misinformed about the potential for data leakage. Meaning, if they are deploying an enterprise version of AI, let's say from Amazon or OpenAI or Microsoft or SAP, that their data is secure. And I'm sort of surprised how much this issue is still lingering around enterprise. I'm not talking about personal AI. I'm talking about enterprise AI. If you buy, again, an enterprise grade solution, should we still be concerned about leakage as a CEO?
No, I think overall there's no concern anymore if you purchase that from any of the classical standard providers, right? They all, meanwhile, also have right. There's always then the question is just the inferencing, right? So you have a prompt, right, or your RAG pipeline, you enter some data, and is the prompt forgotten, right, after, and is the data that is part of the prompt, for example, and as part of
Right.
the context window, is that lost? And the answer is yes to is a clear yes to this. And quite frankly, but that discussion, my feeling, Greg, is that got way smaller over
That's
the
fair.
last year.
Yeah, that's fair.
I mean,
Yeah, I've
that
said
was always the first question was like, hey, SAP or Microsoft, whoever, like, hey, how do you make sure that I don't find my proprietary company data all of a sudden in ChatGPT? That was
right.
always the first question that everybody asked.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that, no, that is what I meant with the conversation got a little bit more educated, so to speak. I
Yep.
think we are
Yep.
past this. Sometimes it still
Good.
counts, I agree, but it's got way smaller likelihood reduced massively
So,
on.
so, so, so what's gone to the top of the list? And then we'll get to the topic of our conversation, which is why all the
The
AI
question,
stuff.
what
But
no, I think
what are you hearing from what's your top one or two
the
concern
top one or
questions?
two is really what brings value and what
Mhm.
are the use cases that we're focused on. The return on investment question is what is on the top of everybody's mind these days. What are the high value cases that really help me to reduce my spend, right? And or get me more top line with the same amount of headcount I invest today, right, with my existing workforce. Though these are a couple of examples. Oh, no, oh, that is
Right.
that is the predominant question today that we get. And yes, we still have security and legal topics and topics around indemnification and what happens with IP. What I just wanted to add is, meanwhile, also, even if you don't want to, then the question then becomes rather, what do you do, for example, with continuous improvement? A lot of course, whether it's, thumbs up, thumbs down on code generation, right? You see what's been generated, what the developer edited, you feed that back into your reinforcement learning loop, things like this. What happens with that data? Most of the vendors, meanwhile, offer opt out, right? And can opt out from that to not use, I don't know, in my coding editor, the code my developers write, if I consider that as significant IP.
Yep.
So all these things, meanwhile, gotten much, much better. And I think there's a clear no to say in terms of that customers need to be concerned about that.
Yep. All right. We'll go back to ROI later if we have time.
Yeah.
We got to keep the CFO happy at some point. After all the hype is worn off. Let's talk about pilots, though. There's another study from Rand just this last month around how many pilots are stuck in pilot phase or proof of concept phase. The Gartner number I think was 70% of pilots aren't making it to deployment. So what's going on and what can we do about it? So two-part question. Let's talk about why this stuff is getting stuck in deployment phase. You've probably covered some of it already, maybe around
Yeah, we touched on a few. We
yeah,
touched on a few already,
yeah,
right? I mean, again, back to the scalability. One is clearly scalability, right? I mean, for example, everybody built in the last 2 years, I assume everybody and also in the audience, built some kind of proprietary chatbot, right?
mhm,
Hey, chat with my data, my PDF documents, my policies, travel policies, HR policies, whatever you have in the company. And of course, with today's methods, you can build a chatbot that blows off the CFO's socks or CEO's socks, whoever in the C-suite. You can build it in an afternoon, right? Take an espresso, take a medium tutorial. You can build something amazingly great, and 10 documents, not an issue. 100 documents are already a little bit harder. 1,000 documents really becomes a challenge in the right. What is if the relevant result is on top? Because then you realize, oops, just dense naive RAG with dense retrieval, for example, doesn't work. You need to combine it maybe with some re-ranking and some classical information retrieval algorithms to keep the accuracy level, for example, high. And then you go into, if you're working for a large company, not a small company, then the question is like, oh, if I'm an employee in Germany and I ask something about an HR policy, I expect, of course, the local answer in that country, hence
right.
retrieving a different document and answer versus you're asking the same question in Brazil or in the US or in India. And all of a sudden, it becomes a big challenge, right? To integrate all these various aspects, scale it, and so on and so forth, right? And then, of course, ensure data privacy security we touched already. The second big thing clearly is business value. I mean, everybody, of course, understood, or many understood, that of course, in with specifically with Gen AI, many people had to learn things like prompt engineering or overnight or RAG and the different frameworks, LangChain, right? Now agent frameworks, right? From AutoGen over Crew to LangGraph, whatever. And of course, that is great, right? Because you need experimentation, right? Because you want access to as many developers, right? Or people who want to try this out. But at the same time, of course, I mean, we developers, I'm a developer myself, and I probably did this mistake more than anybody else in this room is we developers, we sometimes get hung up too much on our technology love for technology and lose the end side, the end out of sight, which is what's actually the business problem I'm solving here? Why should somebody go and deploy this at scale in production if there is no value in terms of there are some productivity gains or savings or more top line? Back to the ROI question. And then, of course, many get stuck, right? Because then you all of a sudden on the way, while everybody was excited maybe at the beginning, loses interest on the way down the road because the value is simply not there, either because the accuracy is not good enough or the value is too low versus the effort it requires to pull the scenario off. So this is why we see many of the things actually getting stuck. And then in Europe, specifically for our Europe audience, of course, we have a bunch of cool regulations in play, right? And workers' councils and legal and data privacy with
I
GDPR.
love what you call them cool. Okay.
So there's a bunch of no, but I just added there's a bunch of additional
Yeah,
challenges,
it's a
right?
reality. It's a
And then
reality.
you talk about HR. HR is a high risk classification according to EU AI Act. Everybody's like already, ooh, can we really do this? And so there's a couple of additional challenges you get into, of course, also in certain areas.
If we have time, I'm not sure we will. I'd love to circle back and talk about regulation in Europe versus the U.S., the lack of it in the U.S. and how much of it there is in Europe, and what's that mean for the
Oh yeah, absolutely.
future of
I have an
AI.
opinion
But
on that.
let's talk about so my sense then, Philip, is that we have to choose the right projects. We're stuck in pilot in part because perhaps we've chosen the wrong project to begin with, not enough business value. Maybe it's more what I call performative AI. It's a cool demo, but
Mhm.
not really something that can scale and go into production. Any other advice for people that are picking from a long list of potential pilots? I often think the Achilles heel of AI is its breadth of use case, right? Sort of it's not like typical software. It can do so much. But I think that's sort of a strength and a weakness in that it sort of overwhelms people with potential use cases. So how would you advise someone picking from what could be a longer list of potential AI use cases? Is it business value first? Is it technical feasibility? Is it both? Like just
It's
what's the advice?
I think the best ones that we saw is the mix of three things. It's viability, desirability, and viability at the end of the day, right? If you can match these three things nicely together, right? And viability is a function of what's the effort to pull it off versus the value, right? I mean, you can have a low value case. If it's very cheap to produce, it might be still a good case at the end of the day, right? The
Yep,
problem
yep,
is just if that ratio gets out of control, right? And the costs are just like 10 times higher than the actual outcome, then you got trouble on the viability.
yep, yep.
Desirability, know your end customer, right? Work with the whether the CFO. I mean, what I learned the hard way, I could just give you one example with my CFO. I was running around the company with lots of cool use cases all the time because within age, like at the beginning, right, it was all in the unstructured world, right? Like HR or
Right.
service and sales and marketing and commerce, right? Good for certain personas in the company, not so interesting for the CFO. And because the problem was, right, in finance or in supply chain, right, you deal with a lot of structured data, lots of tables, a lot of math, logic, algebra, but something the models are not really good at, right? I mean, now with reasoning models, a little bit of different discussion and with knowledge graphs, etc. Maybe that goes too far, but in the last 2 years, that was a challenge, right? So I couldn't really present compelling use cases, for example, to a CFO. Yeah. But now now it just presented, we have one of the agents that we built as a cash collection agent that, takes complaints of customers by email.
Smart.
And
Going right to the heart of what a CFO cares about, right?
then you say like, oh, that gets my day sales outstanding down by 10%, and I can collect more cash with the same and keep the shared service center for finance at the same level. It's like, and then he came to me and Philip, you got me with that use case, right?
I love it.
And do you want to use that
Yeah.
case?
So what's the difference between feasibility and viability? I don't. What's the difference?
Feasibility is, can you technically pull it off? That was my
Got it.
problem with the finance case because the
Yeah, yeah. Got it.
feasibility in finance was not there because
Yep.
technically it was very hard to solve
For
for
sure.
until very recently.
What's viability?
Viability is the pure economics of
Got it.
does
So
it
the
make
business.
sense to
Got it. Got it.
invest
Love
into
it.
it versus the outcome it eventually yields?
All right, we got a Dr. Philipp Herzig framework here, guys. You heard it here
No,
first.
it's not my framework. It's not my framework, quite frankly. That's a method called design thinking. Was done back in the days between Stanford
Oh, I know. Yeah, yeah, I know.
and Hasso-Plattner Institute here in Potsdam, just for what it's
Okay.
worth.
All right. Well, fine. Well, we can't trademark the IP, but whatever. It's
No,
good.
no, I don't claim trademarks for
It's a
that
good
one.
framework. Okay. I want to talk about engineers. I often think about engineers and engineering organizations, which you
Mhm.
obviously manage one, are canaries in the coal mine, meaning what's happening to them first will happen to the rest of knowledge work, and that we can learn because the AI copilots are so powerful and useful to software engineers. And so I'd like to talk about what's going on in engineering organizations as they use AI, because I think the marketers and the salespeople and the other teams can learn. So could you share what you've observed inside of your organization, Philip, in terms of the adoption of these tools and just what can we learn from, what you see?
It's an interesting question, right? I mean, first of all, of course, all our thousands of developers, right? No matter in which programming language they code every day, right? It's a wide range of things like Java, JavaScript, Python, obviously. Some of you, I don't know whether this is known. We have SAP has an own programming language called ABAP. We also created an own large language model for this. It's a it's a language that actually most of the world economy is running on, just nobody knows it. and and no, what we basically see is, I mean, they are using this essentially every day, right? I mean, it's very, very clear, and we have seen tremendous results. At the beginning, it was more like really um, on the test generation, right? Documentation generation, all the things that are surrounding the code.
Ancillary, right?
Yeah,
Tasks. Yeah. Yeah.
what we haven't seen yet so far, because that phenomenon is, I mean, but I believe this is more from an ISV point of view. This whole vibe coding and so on that is currently going on, like you can very quickly design the application and so on and so forth. The problem is still the day two thing, right? Because we built these large systems, right, with lots of code and so on. And even if it gets it right 80%, right, you have these like 20% that you still need to solve for, right? So we are still, I would say it's really augmentation as of today to really achieve more for our developers, and of course all the things that sometimes you miss out, like writing good unit tests, writing good integration tests, for example, writing good documentation so others can pick up the work. And so on, that maybe sometimes if you're under pressure, right, and you need to deliver and crank
Right.
features
You,
right
you,
all day
you
long.
skip you skip those
Yeah,
steps, right?
you skip them sometimes to hide all your continuous integration and delivery pipelines and so on. But of course, we see this right in infrastructure as code. We see this in the application code. We see this in the user experience, right? So of course, we have massively also accelerated our output, right, in terms of what we can deliver in the various organizations with the help of AI.
Yep. I want to give you a scenario, Philip, and get your advice. So, two choices. There's more, but I'll just present two choices. I'm uh, I'm a leader of a company, a CEO, whatever, GM, president, doesn't matter. I see two choices. One is deploy an LLM, a best of class LLM. Pick your favorite model, so to speak, to everyone in the organization and do the hard labor of the training and the change management, reducing the anxiety, getting
Mhm,
people to find their use cases, basically get a little more organic, right?
mhm.
But invested in and supported versus that's one option, and get the productivity gains hopefully from that, meaning everybody using an LLM of some sort, sometime every day or every week. The other would be go and find targeted use cases inside of large parts of my organization, engineering, marketing, sales, it doesn't really matter where, and more kind of rifle shots to build, agents, GPTs, whatever they are, even prompt libraries, just
Mhm.
like codify more the deployment of the AI into specific use cases. And I can only do one. Which one would you do? And first, I guess.
That's a tricky question because my answer would be you'd need to navigate a little bit both in
You
my
would, you would,
mind.
okay, so you would want to do both
Yeah,
if you
and
could.
I would not over-index on just one approach at the end of the day. And to your point, what I would rather add to your point is, and this is what I see also with many customers. Of course, at the beginning, everyone went with the I build everything myself approach, right? That's and that was required, of course, the last 2 years, as of course the SaaS players, it took them a while to build, of course, useful cases also as part of their products.
Yep.
But now take, for example, the HR scenarios that we ship as part of our, the customer's just like, so what? I'm anyway using SAP success factors and we have all these phenomenal, right? Now we just, right, gives you just one example, talking quickly about SAP, right? If you
Yeah.
now
Yeah.
goal and performance management in SAP, it's just a prompt now, right? Inside that. So why wouldn't you, people just start using that, right? If they're
Right. Turn it
dedicated
on and
to
start
HR,
using it.
and then
Yeah.
you just write a prompt and boom, the goal is in the system, right? And then you can go back and forth with your employees versus doing this extra on the side and something. And then of course the customer's going like, why should I invest into that, right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So what we see is the customers that are more mature already in their journey is to say like, they clearly separate between can they get the standard stuff to run their company more effectively from a standard vendor, an ISV, right? That just embeds these experience in the workflows and the business processes today, versus focus the custom development really on the things that are part of their core value prop. Like
Mhm.
if you talk to a reinsurance company, right, and you have all these things like underwriting, heavy mathematical methods, and so on. If you go to a pharma company and you talk about the development of new drugs, or you go to a you go to a fragrance or to
PPG.
a
Yep.
drink company, right, that designs
Yep.
new recipes for the great new hottest cool new drink for the summer season, right? That's core to their business, right? I mean, I cannot help them, right? I have no clue about these domains, and this is where I then also what we see, or if you go to an automotive company, right, they all build AI into their cars, for example, whatever other vehicles that they should focus on, right? Because I mean, the standard stuff like HR, finance, and so on. Why would you invest your precious dollar? Back to the viability question, right? The
Mhm.
economics just don't work. Yeah.
So let me put you on the spot here with a related question. So here's what I believe, and I tell CEOs. I'd be curious if you agree that if you do successfully deploy AI into your organization, let's say it's a best of
Yeah.
class LLM, and you get, maybe past 50% adoption, so people really using it every week, perhaps every day, that you will see a 10% productivity lift across the knowledge workforce. So certainly only for employees that are sitting in front of a computer, at a desk, whatever, at a keyboard, you'll see a 10% productivity lift or time savings at least
Mhm.
over the course of 12 months. That's your basic business case, Would you agree with that?
Yes, I fully agree with that. I mean, you can now argue is it 10%, is it 20%, right?
Right.
That
Right.
heavily depends also on how the company is run, right? And what the existing
Sure.
processes are and how they deal with it, which maybe other automation methods did they have in the past, right? If a customer is heavily optimized the process, I don't know, with good old stuff like RPA or so, right? I mean, that might be a different you find the customer a different condition than a
Yep.
customer who has never done anything or a company. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. This is exactly what our data also suggests, what we see also with our customers. Absolutely. And now with agents, of course, it's the next level on top of that as they reason and act on top of what's already built. Yeah.
We have obviously, as you know, and we see it in all the survey data, including a survey. Section does a survey twice a year of
Mhm.
5,000 knowledge workers, the U.S., UK, Canada, and we see other surveys around the level of anxiety and concern inside of the workforce about AI, which is probably hindering its adoption at some level, in some companies at least. So, what do you think's happening here as it relates to work? We've used this meme the last 2 years. I think it's bullshit personally, which is you won't lose your job to AI, you'll lose your job to someone using AI. I think we say that because it sounds comforting. I don't think that's the reality personally, but I'm curious what you think in terms of how quickly this is moving, in terms of the capabilities and its ability to complete at least tasks and if not jobs. What's your level of concern, Phil?
Well, so far we agreed with each other, Greg. I need to disagree on that one. And I just take
Okay.
exactly the example of coding again. And I take also music as an example, right? Most of the stuff that people do in knowledge work is way below of what the human is actually capable of doing because they're busy. Look at what people are busy all day long. They look up the data in the system. They look this and that, right? They come up to a
They cut and
conclusion,
paste. Yeah,
cut and
yeah.
paste stuff from left to right. Oh, where's this Word document? Where was this PowerPoint again? Can't find it, right? And like all these things, right? There and take coding, for example, right? I actually disagree with some statements. It's like I don't learn coding anymore, and so on and so forth. Because I think coding a little bit is like going to law school, right? You learn how to think in a structured way. At least it helped me. I was a pretty unstructured guy. Coding helped me always to kind of organize myself in the head way better. And quite frankly, good coding is good, or good programming is actually more of a liberal art than it's just like bringing out some lines of code. Because a really good, I always say a good developer, a senior developer, how you can differentiate it from a junior developer is just ask them what their favorite programming language is. And the junior developer will exactly tell you, I don't know, it's JavaScript or TypeScript, whatever it answers. And senior developers will ask you, what's the problem I should solve? And I will pick the right tools. What are the trade-offs? What are the design decisions I need to take as part of the architecture? And then I will design that accordingly for you. It's a little bit like with music. I was a semi-professional musician for 20 years, playing guitars. And, you know, it's phenomenal what these music generators can do. But, really writing a song that touches people's hearts and feelings, that's songwriting is something that is this is art, right? This is not just, oh, I get the math right, that the notes sound right. That's all the math you can learn with an AI model, you can generate with an AI model. The feelings and really making this touchable and designing something, right, that's useful and people want to listen to or use, that's a whole different story in my mind. And there I don't have an answer when and if that will be disrupted in a certain way. But I believe strongly in human ingenuity on driving things forward. And a lot of people in workplace, quite frankly, are distracted with a lot of stuff, right? That is
That's fair. So you're less concerned about job loss.
well, there will be transformation, some job roles, some right. The definition on how we think about this today will maybe not exist anymore. And I don't have the crystal ball for every role how it will transform, right? I'm also not an expert in many roles, to be honest. It will fundamentally transform, but it will still exist. I give you another, just to make that point very clear. In 1980 or 1981, SAP introduced an accounting system. It was the first accounting system in the world. This is why SAP is market leader in finance, right? And it's the best finance system in the world. What did people do prior to the introduction of SAP finance software in the workplace? Well, an accountant, take an accountant, right? An accountant, what did they do? Saw money coming, they saw invoices, order entries coming in and money going out. And then they kept the books, right? At the end of the day, or the month or the period, they went through the paper and then they took a balance and they looked at, oh, who do I need to done? Who do I still need to pay? And so on and so forth. That all we got all rid of this because we got them in a financial system. And at the end of the period, you click a button, you call it financial close, you do a Dunning run, you do a payment run, it's all automated. Accountants still exist. They just do totally different things these days. They think about how to manage working capital, how to deal with equity, how to optimize the cash flow, right? And how to deal with taxes, right? All these different things. An accountant does a very, very different role than 50 years ago because of this introduction, right? But they still exist and they do a very important job in companies these days.
All right, that was persuasive, and I'm listening. Honestly, Philip, I'm a little more concerned, at least in
Okay.
these transition moments. But I'm optimistic. I consider myself a pragmatic optimist as it relates to AI. I'm hoping we get most of the good, and that we don't
No, absolutely. Yes, yes, yes.
we don't pay too much for it. I think the tech industry, and I'm speaking not about SAP, but about Silicon Valley. I think the Silicon Valley is good at making a lot of promises around what could happen, and then doesn't always cash those checks. Social media being the obvious example, at least I'd say globally and in the U.S. Obviously, the last 10 years, there was a lot of cost to it
Yeah.
that were unreckoned for. When we were sold the
No,
idea.
absolutely. I mean, at the end of, and that to your point, right? I think it is very important not just to look at what the tech does, but also how to actually take everyone along the way in a responsible fashion, right? And this is also, we didn't now touch on the EU AI Act, right? This is why I actually believe, while of course at the beginning it's of course slowing down adoption a little bit, I think it will create a path towards a more sustainable future at the end of the day. So I'm not in conflict, right, with what for example, the UAI Act is. Yes, it makes you maybe slower at the beginning. As long as you balance that out, it will also give you a little bit pathway of how to design it in a more sustainable way.
For sure, yeah, and we obviously swung the other way in the U.S. at least, as you know. with the rescission of the Biden AI safety regulation. So we'll see how that unfolds. We'll have these different case studies from around the world: China, Europe, United States, and presumably others. We need to navigate what's coming, and the more of us that are educated, informed, and engaged and curious about this, the better. Many are not. Many are anxious and scared, and we need to help them. We need to get people able to work with their AIs and stay employable, quite frankly. And so I appreciate everyone for investing in themselves and joining us today.